Hello, Professor Wang and Professor Cahill. So nice to have you today. So I would like to get to know a little bit more about your research on monopolies in Europe. Of course, before we start, so our audience can know you better, do you mind introducing yourself to our audience and the listeners here?
Yeah, sure. So shall I go first? Yeah, thank you. So my name is Dr. Jing Wang. I'm associate professor working at the University of Leicester School of Law in the UK. And nice to meet you here and nice to participating in this event.
Hello,
Thank
I'm
you.
Professor Dermot Cahill. I'm talking today from the UK. I am a director of an international consultancy, trade consultancy called Help Us Trade. And formerly, I was the Dean of the Law School at the University of Wales in Bangor in the United Kingdom for over 11 years. And I have written books and edited books in antitrust law published by Oxford and Cambridge University presses. So I'm really delighted to be here with you today and talking to you in China. I think part of the challenge is in the word global. These online platforms often operate globally, and so national regulators of anti-monopoly law, as you call it in China, they often have a national focus, but actually, of course, these online platforms operate globally, and so a lot of national regulators will be at a disadvantage when trying to regulate the anti-competitive activities, the anti-monopoly activities of the global online platforms. Now, you have some big international regulators like the European Commission who assert worldwide jurisdiction over anti-competitive activities outside of their area where they affect competition inside the area they regulate. But most regulators only operate nationally. So this is another challenge that faces the regulation of global online platforms. And then the other one I would mention, of course, is the use of onerous contractual terms that put the online platforms, because of their huge bargaining power, it puts them in a far stronger bargaining position when they're signing up new users to their platforms, and so they can impose very onerous contractual conditions on the users of their platforms, which again gives them massive power over those who are using the platform.
So if we look into anti-monopoly law of China 22nd, the first article actually already mentioned that this law is enacted for the purpose of preventing and restraining monopolist conduct, protecting fair competition. So the competitors are actually being protected by law, even though the consumers are always being the focus of the law, the competitors are still here. And the platforms as gatekeepers in the digital market, so they actually will be able to restrict the access to sellers, which is a unique element of the digital market. First of all, it can have a massive negative impact on their business, of all of those small sellers' business. And secondly, there is the risk of conflict of interest. In other words, which I already mentioned, the platform who is actually a provider, a platform for those online shops, for those small companies to sell their products. They're as well as a competitor to all of those small companies who are selling their products. So for example, Amazon, who actually also selling their own products, have already been able to work out a way by using algorithms to either prefer their own products or having their preferred products to list when consumers actually search anything they would like to buy. What being preferred or produced by Amazon usually come up first. And they call this as an Amazon buy box. And Amazon claimed that this is a fair competition because they wanted to promote the best value for money for consumers. However, the existing EU investigation already showed that Amazon are actually request users, small sellers, to pay to be put into the buy box. So that's not really the best value for money. That's actually be able to put many small sellers there, to put them in a very disadvantaged position, because their products, when consumer search, probably never really being listed, or they being listed in 100 page, which consumers cannot see. And in a way, this harm consumers' interest as well, because consumers cannot really being show the best value for money products. Professor Cahill, would you like to add anything more?
I think that's a great example, because what it does is it shows how the platform operator, in this case Amazon, is putting some companies' products in a disadvantageous position compared to either its own products, because Amazon does have its own products now that it's selling on its own platform, so it's in a conflict of interest situation, or also it's giving a preferential position to companies who paid for a preferential listing in the buy box. Again, that puts other companies' products at a disadvantage. So that's a classic example of how online platforms are gatekeepers to the market, because they control access to the market, but also they can be a player in the market. And so there's an inevitable conflict of interest arising. Just to give one other example to what Jing has said there, 2017 Google Shopping in Europe, the European Commission fined Google 2.42 billion euro for abusing its market dominance as a search engine, whereas it had over 90% of the market, because it conferred an illegal advantage on its own Google Shopping service. So we've Googled the platform, and then we've the Google Shopping service, which of course is competing against other shopping services. And so inevitably it was found to be abusing its dominant position in the way that it gave always preference to its own shopping service. So it is, I think it's very important to think not just about the impact of monopoly online platforms practices, impacts on consumers, but also on sellers. It takes several years to conclude one of these investigations because they're very difficult. Defining the relevant market can be very difficult, and also extracting information from the marketplace by the regulators can be very difficult. And so often it takes a number of years before they come to ultimate decision stage. Another example would be Amazon's buy box. So Amazon buy box was investigated in 2019 by the European Commission in Brussels for allegedly giving preference to either its own products or to Amazon preferred products. These are other companies' products that Amazon would give preferential status to by putting them very visibly into its buy box. The European Commission investigation never came to formal decision because the case was settled because Amazon offered to change its practices to remove the anti-competitive threat.
So Apple has always been subject as an investigation, and an investigation has been ongoing in the European Union as also as many European member states about their high commission fees. And recently, it's just happened last week, at the national level in the UK, 1,500 app developers has launched a class action in the UK against Apple, contesting their high commission fees. And this may be useful for you guys to know, because this is a case that the small competitors who are using the platform to sell their products are actually come together to brought a class action to fight or against the big platform who treat them discriminatively and will treat them in a disadvantaged position because they already entered into applied a high commission fee to all of those small competitors.
What is the right way to respond to this kind of situation? So if we go back to the United Brands case, back in the 70s in Europe. That was involved in the distribution of banana products. The court looked at how should a dominant player. So we have to assume now that the company that's acting badly is dominant. Okay, dominant means that it's the most powerful player in the market and that it really controls the market. It's not necessarily a monopoly. There will be other competitors, but they're not big enough to control its behavior. Or in other words, when it does something that's not good, or that looks very poor from a competition point of view, the others are not big enough to take advantage of that and provide competition in the market. So assuming now that a company is dominant, what the court said was that if one of your customers is not, for example, looking after the product properly, then you have to treat them in a proportionate way. So, for example, maybe give them a warning, maybe point out where they're breaching the contract and give them an opportunity to remedy the breach. And that cutting off supplies, which is kind of similar in the online world to cutting off access to your bank account or freezing your funds or alleging that you, the seller, have breached conditions in the online platform without providing evidence that you have to you to see how you might have breached it, that looks like disproportionate behavior by a dominant player. Now, the reason why this is an interesting question is because if this is happening to Chinese companies outside of China, probably the best course of action for the Chinese companies is to actually take up the matter with Western competition regulators rather than with the Chinese regulator. Because remember, I said to you, a problem for Chinese law at the moment is that Chinese competition law will only have a reach out to things that are happening outside of China if it affects competition back inside China. And assuming that that's not the case, in other words, assuming that the poor behavior of the online platforms in the West and the way they treat Chinese sellers on their platforms in the West, assuming it doesn't have any impact on it. However, I think that Western regulators, such as the European Commission or the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, I think that they might be very interested to hear about this poor treatment of Chinese companies for several reasons. The first reason is that we consume vast amounts of Chinese originating products, so they're necessary for our economies to function, and our consumers want them. Secondly, they're often sold at very competitive prices. And so at the moment, we have a big inflation bubble in the West. And so it's not in our interests for goods from China to be suddenly cut off from the marketplace by an online platform that might accuse them of breaching its rules. And coming back then specifically to answer your question about how should we regard this behavior, I think that if a company has been selling goods on a platform and suddenly it's contacted out of the blue and told your account is frozen, we're holding funds in your account, we're not giving them to you because you have breached the rules of using our platform, without giving any evidence as to those breaches, that looks to me like abusive behavior. And so if a dominant platform has engaged in that kind of behavior, you could argue that this is like a refusal to supply its services without an objective justification. And if that is happening on some kind of widespread scale, then I think that Western competition monopoly regulators would be very interested to hear about it and perhaps investigate it, because it's going to affect competition as well in our economies here in the West if those goods are now cut off from access to the marketplace by the actions of the online platform.